Hey, welcome to the Rum Revival. My name's Arminder, and this is my guide to all things Jamaican rum. Now, if you want to know what makes them unique, how they're made, and who the various producers are, and lastly, my recommendations for Jamaican rums to start you on your rum journey, then this is the video for you. Now, first and foremost, what's the big deal about Jamaican rums? What makes them stand out? What are they known for? Well, they're often known for having a fruity and sometimes funky flavor profile and aroma. Many of them can taste very different than your run-of-the-mill rums. Now, many times that fruity note that I mentioned isn't just like generic fruit. Sometimes it might be like a light peach or apricot, but oftentimes it's notes of tropical fruit, but not just any old tropical fruit. Oftentimes it's bananas and or pineapples. And who doesn't like bananas and pineapples? But it's also not just like any old bananas and pineapples, because sometimes it's overripe bananas and pineapples. You know, that more kind of intensely tasting, slightly sweeter, slightly pungent taste of overripe fruit. And sometimes it's not just overripe, hell, it's rotting sometimes. Now, does that sound appealing to you? Well, it kind of should, because while you probably shouldn't be eating rotting fruit in your rum, buddy, you have not lived until you tried it. Now, as you start varying into that stronger, pungent, overripe, and rotting territory, there's some other notes that might be present as well. Petrol and gasolines, industrial notes, nail polish remover, some spice, some sour or acidic notes. Now, collectively, with those kind of bolder fruit notes, folks will often refer to this mix of flavors and aromas as funky or funk, which might feel like a meaningless term, like what does funk taste like? And I think in this case, you really just gotta try it once or twice and it'll totally make sense. Now, not every Jamaican rum will be like this. There's a whole spectrum of flavors, right? Some of them are gonna be on the lighter, kind of more fruity side of things, but others are gonna fill up the room with the funkiest, foulest, yet mouth-wateringest banana that you've ever smelled. Now, another thing about those fruity and funky flavors and aromas, you know what they're also really good for? Cocktails. Yeah, Jamaican rums are phenomenal in cocktails. Those big, bold, tropical fruit notes work really well with fruit juices, syrups, and spices. Oftentimes, there's like an alchemy in play where the funky fruit notes often get amplified in a cocktail and you end up with a Technicolor tropical symphony in your mouth. Now, all you gotta do is like drink a good Mai Tai made with a quality Jamaican rum, and you'll know what I'm talking about. How do Jamaican distilleries get their rums to smell and taste all fruity and funky? Well, it's primarily because of a couple of things that they can do during fermentation that creates all those amped up flavors and aromas. So you're not only just creating alcohol during fermentation, but you're also creating different flavor compounds like different congeners and esters, and it's the specific compounds that are present as well as their like overall concentration that contributes in a big way to the flavor and aroma of the final rum. Now, this is the case with all rums, not just Jamaican rums, and really it's the case with all spirits. But many Jamaican distilleries like to really go all in on fermentation to produce those more pronounced fruity and funky fermentation flavors. Now, without going into too much detail, here are some of the things that they do in this process. First up, there's the type of yeast strain that they use. Each type of yeast generally will produce a certain range of flavors. So they might use certain commercially available or proprietary strains that create and emphasize more of those flavors that they're looking for in their rum. Or instead of using like a regular or proprietary yeast strain, they might just let the environment do their job for them by letting the natural yeast and bacteria that's in the air kickstart a natural wild fermentation. So instead of just adding one controlled yeast strain that kind of creates a set range of flavors, now you're going to get this whole blend, this kind of whole soup of varied ranges of flavors from who knows how many different yeast strains and bacteria. So you might get these kind of complementary and conflicting flavors all jumbled up in the final rum. Now, another technique is that they might extend their fermentation to a very long time. See, like a standard rum fermentation might be like 1 or 2 days, but in some cases, Jamaican distilleries might go like 2 or 3 weeks, and the more time you give during fermentation, the more time and opportunity you give for the creation of those flavor compounds. And the more of those that you produce, the bolder and more pungent and more funkier that rum is going to turn out. Now also, a Jamaican distillery might also add in some additional ingredients into the mix of what is being fermented. So instead of just a mix of water and molasses and or cane juice, they might add in acidic and bacteria-rich ingredients like cane acid, dunder, which is like the leftover remains of previous distillations, as well as muck, which is a thick, foul-smelling ooze. Now their inclusion will turbocharge the creation of those fruity and funky flavors. So those are the fermentation techniques that a Jamaican distillery might use. And they might just use one of them, or they might use all of them. But another key production process is the use of pot distillation. By distilling their rums on a pot still, they end up retaining much more of those flavors that were created during fermentation. Now, potentially with the column still, if it was distilled to a very high enough ABV, you might strip out all of those flavors that were created during fermentation and you just kind of end up with a very light rum. So the pot still will actually retain and concentrate much more of those flavors, and you end up with a heavier distillate that is not only a lot more flavorful, but has more texture and presence. Now, here's the thing. Not all Jamaican rums are all pot still rums. A lot of them are, but some of them are blends of pot and column still rums. Now, the lighter column rums will kind of help spread out and lighten up the heavier, funkier pot still rum in the blend. And in theory, this should also make the rum a bit cheaper, but I don't know if that always works that way. And the thing is, like, a pot column blend can still be flavorful, but sometimes it feels like an all pot still Jamaican rum is kind of like on a whole different level. So that, in a nutshell, is what Jamaican distilleries do to create the funky flavors and aromas of their rums. Now, before we move on to some bottle recommendations, let's do a quick tour of the 6 distilleries that are on the island, and I'm going to talk about them in pairs. Now, first we've got Appleton Estate and New Yarmouth. Now, both of them are owned by J. Ray and Nephew, which itself is owned by Campari. And they are the biggest producer of Jamaican rums on the island, and their brands that you can find here in the US include Appleton Estate, Karuba, and Ray and Nephew. Then we have Long Pond and Clarendon Distilleries. Now, both of them are owned by National Rums of Jamaica, which itself is owned in a 3-way split between the Jamaican government, Maison Ferrand, which makes Ferrand Cognac and the Planere Rum brand, and then the last third is owned by Demerara Distillers Limited, the folks that make El Dorado out in Guyana. And all I gotta say is, what a bunch of strange bedfellows. Now, National Rums of Jamaica, their brands include Money Musk and Long Pond. Then we've got Hampden Estate and Worthy Park Estate. Now, they're not related, but they're both smaller, family-owned, independent distilleries. So starting with Hampden Estate, they in particular really like to use all those fermentation techniques to create some really funky and pungent rums. Now, their house brands include Hampden Estate and Rumfire. And then there's Worthy Park Estate, and what's really cool about them is that they grow their own sugarcane and they have their own sugar factory, which means they not only get to make their own sugar and they sell that, but they also make their own molasses, which they then use to make their own rum. And all of that, that's a bit of a rarity in the rum world. Now, their house brands include Worthy Park and Rum Bar. Now, every single Jamaican rum out there on the market is made at one of those 6 distilleries. Unless, of course, it's a blend, which in that case, it could be made at a couple of those distilleries. Now, in terms of the brands that you're going to find out in the market, there are far more than those 8 or 9 house brands that I mentioned. And that's because those 6 distilleries, they'll sell some of their rum either in bulk or by the cask to third parties. Now, they might sell their rum directly to a brand or company who will then bottle up that rum and then sell it to me and you. More common than that, though, is that distilleries will usually sell directly to a broker. A broker will buy rums from distilleries around the world, and they're the ones that will sell to a third-party brand, and that brand will then bottle up the rum and then sell it to me and you. Now, some of the more popular non-distilling brands that put out Jamaican rums include Myers, Smith & Cross, and Hamilton. All right, so we know what they taste like, how they're made, and who actually makes them. Now let's move on to my bottle recommendations. Now I'm going to start with a recommendation based on if you've never had a Jamaican rum before, and then I'll give you a couple of different paths that you can go down depending on what you want to explore next. So let's start off with your very first bottle. Say you've never had a Jamaican rum before and you want to go out right now, after watching this video of course, and you want to try some. In that case, I'm going to recommend a rum that is generally very widely available and very affordable, and that's the Appleton Signature. Now, this is a pot column blend that's 40% ABV and aged just a handful of years, and it's definitely on the light fruity side of things. There's a little bit of like maybe stone fruit there, but it's definitely not big, bold, and funky at all. And that's why I actually think it makes for a good first introduction. It's not going to hit you over the head, but hopefully it will be a tantalizing tease of what Jamaican rums are capable of. Now, if you like this level of fruitiness, but maybe you're looking for a bit of age and oak notes to it, then definitely check out the rest of the Appleton lineup, particularly the 8-year and the 12-year. While they are still pot column blends, they are a little higher in ABV at 43% and are, good to sip on neat and make for delicious Mai Tais. Now, once you've dabbled with the Appleton stuff and you want to experience what an all pot still Jamaican rum tastes like, something with a bit of perceivable funk to it, then I recommend Worthy Park Select. Now this is a great transition from the signature since it's still 40% ABV and it's also just aged a handful of years, but you'll get less of that light fruitiness found in the signature and more of a textured like baking spice note and some like overripe banana. Now from there, if you want to dial it up a couple notches, then check out Smith & Cross. Now this is a big leap up both from the signature and the select since it's a all pot still rum that's bottled at 57% ABV. Now this will hit much harder on the palate due to that high ABV. There's more pronounced spiciness on the palate, there's some oak, but there's also some astringency, some light plastic industrial notes, and some sweet charred pineapple. Now if you've dabbled with these rums and you're really digging the bold flavors, but you really want to jump headfirst into like strong rotting fruit territory, then here's what I recommend. I'd recommend the Hamilton Pot Still Black or the Hamilton Pot Still Gold. Now these are the same unaged rum from Worthy Park, bottled at 46.5% ABV. The major difference being that they have different levels of caramel color added to them. Now you're gonna get tons of rotting banana with these two and even a little bit of pear, and there's just like the softest note of like a little bit of cough medicine. And then there's Dr. Bird, which is also Worthy Park distillate. Now, this has been aged a couple of years and finished in muscatel wine casks and bottled at a strong 50% ABV. Now, this is drenched in bold, tart, sweet pineapple, but it also has some iodine and like nail polish remover. Now, generally, I think the Hamilton Pot Still stuff is going to be much more approachable than the Dr. Bird, but all of them are going to make for very punchy, bold, overripe, fruit-forward cocktails. Now, if you liked the impact of the high ABV from the Smith & Cross, but you wanted more fruit to it, then I'd recommend checking out an unaged overproof Jamaican rum, and my biggest recommendation would be Rum Fire from Hampden Estate. Now this is bottled at a whopping 63% ABV, it's unaged, and this is probably the rum that has my favorite aroma of any rum, period. Just juicy strawberries and bananas. Now in addition to that strong fruit note on the palate, there is a good amount of industrial notes there as well. And look, this is not gonna be for everyone, that's for sure. I think you'll know pretty quickly if it's your jam or not. Now, that being said, in a cocktail, this more than maybe any other Jamaican rum transforms into that Technicolor tropical symphony that I mentioned at the beginning of the video. Now, a little bit of this stuff goes a long way. Even like a quarter ounce in a cocktail will very much make itself known. So of course, given that, you better believe I like to go all in on Rum Fire in my drinks. Now, if you're looking for some rums that have pronounced fruity and funky notes, but also a good amount of age and oak on them, then I'd check out the Worthy Park Single Estate Reserve, which is aged between 6 to 10 years, or the Hampden 8-year, which is aged 8 years. Now they're both pot still rums, bottled at around 45 to 46% ABV. Both make for some very fine sipping rums and also some fantastic rum old fashions. The Worthy Park tastes like a little bit of like banana bread, some black pepper, and some tobacco, while the Hampden gives you like this ginger, pineapple, chocolate note. Now, if you're watching this and you've already had like one Jamaican rum before, there's a decent chance that it might be Myers, which in my opinion isn't really like much of a Jamaican rum. I mean, technically it's a rum from Jamaica, but it doesn't really taste like what you'd expect. In my opinion, it's more of a dark rum. Now, if you're watching this and you're a fan of Myers, I'd actually recommend checking out Karuba. Here you're gonna get a little hint of fruitiness while still getting that bittersweet molasses note that you're looking for in a dark Jamaican rum. Now, if you're digging the Karuba, but you want higher ABV and more pronounced boldness and funk, then check out Worthy Park 109. Unlike the Myers and the Karuba, which are pot calm blends, this is a blend of all pot still rums. There's notes of chocolate, brown sugar, some coffee, some pineapple, and a pop of acidity. Now, at some point on this journey, you might start finding yourself getting really obsessive about this stuff. You might start getting really nerdy about the ins and outs of each of the distilleries and their production processes. And if that's the case, we need to talk about marks. No, not these kind of marks. See, each distillery doesn't just have one recipe that they follow during the fermentation and distillation process. In fact, most distilleries have a number of recipes, and each recipe calls for a different blend or proportion of base ingredients, as well as varying lengths and types of fermentation, as well as how it's distilled. And all of those differences result in different tasting and smelling distillates. Now, Jamaican distilleries will refer to each of their unique recipes and distillates as marks. Now, they'll give these marks different names, often with the use of various letters and symbols. Now, to learn more about marks and to see how the difference in fermentation can affect a rum, my recommendation would be to buy the Hampden Estate 8-mark set. This set includes all 8 of Hampden's marks bottled unaged and at 60% ABV, and it comes with this really cool in-depth handout that really goes into all the details about the different production processes for each of the marks, as well as like a chemical analysis of all the esters that are present. Like it's a pretty big deep dive. Now, by tasting through each of these marks, you'll really get to experience how those differences in production result in different tasting rums. And really, this is a real educational yet still fun experience in a box that you can do with friends. And I think you'll come out of this experience having a favorite mark. Now, you might be asking, what's your favorite mark, Arminder? Well, I think maybe Mark Paul Gosselaar from Saved by the Bell. Though, if I'm being real, it's probably Mark Lynn Baker from Perfect Strangers. What can I say? I am a Cousin Larry guy all the way. So let's say you've done your deep dive into the 8-mark set, or you've researched some of the other marks from some of the other distilleries. Where do you take it from here? Well, now, my friend, get ready to open up your wallet and dive into the deep and expensive world of single cask releases. Typically, most of the other rum releases out there are blends of multiple casks worth of rum, whether they're from the same mark or a couple different marks. But with single cask releases, what you're gonna get in the bottle is rum from just one cask. Now, typically it's one mark that a distillery has been aging in one cask, though it might have moved into a different cask or casks for some additional aging. So what is the big deal about all this stuff? Well, one, these releases usually are not proofed down with water or very little, so they're pretty high in ABV. Two, many times it's the only way to get to try that single mark by itself because it might otherwise only be used to be part of a blend for a year-round release. And three, that single cask rum is a unique offering. Even if you were to take the same mark made from the same production batch, but you were to put it into a different cask and age it for the same amount of time, it will taste slightly to potentially very different. And that's because each cask, in a way, is its very own unique snowflake. The wood from each cask will have its own different types and concentrations of flavor compounds. Additionally, depending on where the cask is aged, the temperature and weather conditions can affect the aging process, like how much of the rum and or the water is evaporated, how much of the compounds from the wood are extracted into the rum. All of that can change how one cask of the same mark tastes compared to another. Now, because we're talking about a cask's worth of rum, there's going to be a finite amount of liquid. So typically, at most, only about 250 bottles of that rum will be available. So given the rarity and the specificity of the cask and its high proof, it's not going to be cheap. But for many people, it's a way to explore variations of their favorite mark or to drink something that feels like a unique offering. Now, typically, you'll find that distilleries and their house brands don't usually release single cask rums. You'll most likely find them released by third-party bottlers who have either sourced that cask directly from the distillery or from a broker. Now, given how limited they are, I don't really have a specific bottle recommendation to look for, but keep an eye out for single cask Jamaican releases from bottlers like Holmes Key, Down Island Spirits, Rolling Fork, Roaming Road, and many more. All right, so those were my bottle recommendations and paths to explore. Now, let's be very clear, you absolutely do not have to follow all or any of these particular paths that I've laid out. There isn't like an end goal here, right? Like if you liked Appleton Signature and you're more than happy with it, then just chill there. That being said, if you're willing to give a couple of other rums a try, you might find that you really dig them. And with that, we're at the end of my Jamaican rum guide. I really hope this was helpful and gave you a better understanding about the world of Jamaican rums. And lastly, if you want to support the channel, then check out my Patreon page where you can find some exclusive content. You can get access to the Rum Revival Discord server where you can chat with fellow rum lovers. Thank you so much for watching. Catch y'all next time. Cheers.